quilting last summer, which is crazy to think that I've only been quilting for less than a year now. I've been sewing for a long time. I actually used to own a business sewing aprons for not just wholesale, like restaurants, bakeries, etc., but also I ran a successful Etsy shop for a long time, and I got, really burnt out of sewing. You can make thousands of aprons and it's great, but at some point you need a break, and I took a break from sewing and I picked up knitting for a long time, which I loved, but I totally wrecked my hands knitting, and so I had to take a break from that too. And quilting just kind of unexpectedly filled that gap for me of that creative need, meaning that need to sit and have something creative and repetitive and creating something tangible. So when you start with quilting, a quilt is basically a sandwich of backing, a batting, and a quilt top. And what I'm doing here is just ironing out a little bit of my backing fabric, which is just a scrap I had laying around, which you can tell it's been folded for a long time. I wasn't being too precious about getting all the folds out because it's going to be the inside of a pillow, so no one's going to see it anyway. So I'm spreading everything thin and flat, picking off little strings, and then I'm going to put my batting layer down, which is just a cotton batting. I like cotton, I like poly, I like an 80-20 blend. This one's just cotton. Spreading everything flat. Another press, you can press cotton with your iron, obviously, and just trying to get the big creases out. And so I'm going to lay my top down, which is just made out of some scraps of reproduction prints that I had, along with this kind of taupey rosy color that I love and use for everything. And just sweeping away all the creases. That brush works really nicely for that, but you could just use your hands too. Picking those strings off. There's always little strings. They're always all over our house and my pants and our dogs and in our drinks. Pressing. Again, most of sewing is ironing. It's like a 60-40 thing. 60% of your time is ironing. The rest is sewing. So just spreading everything flat. Getting as many creases out as possible. It makes it easier to quilt in the long run, whether you're hand quilting or machine quilting. I found when I make my quilt sandwiches that these little curved safety pins are excellent, especially when I'm using my kitchen table. I can just press the pin down till I find the table, and it just takes a little turn to get the end of the pin back into the clasp. So I always start in the middle and then spread and work my way out, trying to keep everything as flat as possible. I do a lot of lap quilting, so I'm not typically using a hoop or a frame or anything like that, except for if I'm doing something that's really detailed or really precious that needs a lot of tension. But since I really like the rustic, handmade look, just holding something in my lap suits my style well and is comfortable, and I can quilt while I'm outside watching the kids or watching TV or sitting anywhere around the house. So from here, after I've finished pinning my piece together, my quilt sandwich, I'm just going to do a zigzag edge on my sewing machine just to hold everything together, since it's such a small piece and I've gotten it so flat and all the bunching out. It's just going to hold everything together for me so I can really comfortably hold it on my lap. I don't zigzag stitch the edges of big quilts. I just pin really heavily. I don't typically do that because I don't want to make any weird bunching around the borders. I try to go outside in, and I don't want to sort of trap myself with having sewn edges before I'm ready for them. So just trimming off the extra here. I like it neat and tidy. my quilt sandwich all put together nicely, I gather up my little basket of tools and my thread. There's a leather thimble. I really like the leather ones. They still give me that kind of sense of freedom of motion and still protect my fingers well. And little snips, the sharper the better, the littler the better. A needle threader, not necessary, but very helpful. And then really, I'm not picky about my needle. I like them a little thicker because I tend to bend them with my thumbs. And so if there's somewhere in the thickness that I can't bend them with my thumb, but they don't leave huge holes in my fabric. I wish I could tell you what size this is, but honestly, I have no idea. So I'm gonna use my thread, which is just the cotton, $2 spool of thread from Hobby Lobby, which I use for pretty much every project, honestly. I like the thickness. I like that you can see the stitches, and it comes in about every color you could imagine. I tend to just go with cream, but I've done green and I've done pink, but the cream is nice. So once I get my needle threaded, I'm just going to tie a very simple knot in the end of my thread. And with this thickness of thread, I find that I only need just really one small knot. And I can pop it through that top layer of fabric without it going back out the other side when I pull anchors well enough in the batting. So tying my tiny knot, you can hardly even see it. Putting my armor on. And then to start, I'm going through just the top layer of the fabric. So between the top layer and the batting, not all the way through the quilt sandwich. Giving myself about a ½ inch so that I know that the tail of my thread will be hidden. Pressure between the long end and the short end to hold my knot from popping through. And then I'm loading my needle with just a rocking stitch. So I'm trying to get 4 or 5 stitches on to my needle before I pull it through. And this is kind of the secret to quilting evenly and quickly, because you can see the spacing of the stitches on your needle before you pull them through. The goal is probably about 5 to 6 inches, or excuse me, 5 to 6 stitches per inch. So loading my needle again and pulling through, and you have to be careful that you don't use too much tension, because you can cause your fabric to pucker or to gather if you pull too tight. So every once in a while I check my tension and pull my fabric taut again if I need to kind of spread out the stitches. And in case you were wondering, hand stitching does count as steps on an Apple Watch, so I never believe my step count, because there's been days where I've sat on the couch all day and it says that I've walked 10,000 steps, but pretty satisfied knowing that I've probably actually just sewn 10,000 stitches instead. So checking my tension, making sure I don't need to pull my fabric taut to spread the stitches out. Going around the corner, doing the same thing as how I started, by just going through the top layer of fabric and the batting, not the bottom layer. It's so bulky, it's hard to get seams to quilt as easily as the straightaways, so I kind of just skip over that by going through the top layer and the middle layer. Checking tension as we go, and just the same repeating motion over and over again, loading 4 stitches or so onto my needle and pulling it through. Your hands get so strong doing this. It was such a good way to recover from surgery on my hands and get my hand strength, my grip strength back again. You're always sewing towards your indominant hand. So I'm right-handed typically with most things that I do, so I'm always sewing from right to left or away from me. I can sew towards me and I can sew the other way, but it just feels terrible. So here I'm tying my knot and doing the same thing, leaving about a stitch length of thread between the fabric and the knot, so that when I go to sink my knot, it just blends into the rest of the stitches. So going between the top layer fabric and the batting, and checking on the back to make sure I wasn't going through all the layers. And then same thing, just popping my knot in there so it disappears, and then pulling the tension back out and making sure I haven't gathered the stitches by accident. And then I'm gonna go and pull the tail of my thread before I cut it, so that I'm sure that the cut tail won't show on the top of my fabric. It'll sink in against the batting underneath that top layer of fabric. So I'm gonna pull, give myself some slack, and then make sure it's gone, and it's gone. And take out that middle safety pin because I don't need that anymore, because the block itself is holding everything in place. So then I'll go along, and I think I'm gonna stitch along that rosy color just to make the printed fabric really pop. But I might change my mind and stitch on the printed instead, we'll see. And then along the white border. So packing everything up. I like to sew on the porch, but it's time to make something to eat and to head to the couch and probably watch some Gardener's World while I keep working on this square.